What's up guys, Zach from Wired Customs, and today we're installing this brand new American Auto wire harness into this 66 Mustang. Okay, so in this wiring series, we're going to start installing this brand new harness. If you haven't watched my previous videos, this is a Mustang specific. It's 1965 to 1966 Mustang wiring harness. So all the connectors are going to be for like the original fog lights, original headlights, all that kind of good stuff. So that makes it a lot simpler on us. And I'm going to break this down step by step so it's not overwhelming for you. A lot of things I'm going to do is actually going to apply to just wiring in general. I'm going to show you the actual stages, try to break it down into steps so this isn't so complicated. When this is all rolled up into the box, to a lot of people it looks pretty intimidating. Once you understand it, it's not so complicated. I would say it's time consuming, not difficult. There's a difference. So the very first thing I recommend you to do is to open the box and look for the little packing slip. It's going to tell you everything that's supposed to be in the box. Every once in a while you can run into something being missing in the kit. It'd be nice to know that before you have everything all spread out and you put it together and you try to figure out if you lost it or if you didn't get it. That's a pretty frustrating situation. Okay, so I'm going to recommend something that a lot of people probably wouldn't recommend to you first. So after you make sure you have everything, I recommend you to sit down at your dining room table or your office desk or something and actually go through the instructions. Actually read through these. I want you to understand as much as you possibly can before you start throwing it in the car, before you have wires everywhere, before it gets too complicated. Break it down step by step. American Auto Wire actually has a good step-by-step process. I'm going to show you a couple pages, but whatever harness you get, it might be different than what I have here. But you can see here a couple of tools I recommend for you to have. This electrical tape is one of them. I'm not a big fan of electrical tape. You can see in one of my previous videos, I don't know how many times I've taken electrical tape apart and conduit apart, and it's just full of oil, power steering fluid, all sorts of nastiness on the inside. It just traps a lot of moisture, so I try to avoid it. Now we also have these really expensive crimps right here. I don't use those either. I have some, but they aren't absolutely needed. So here's a couple different crimps I'm going to use. This is a big hammer crimp you can get at O'Reilly's. This is going to cramp all of our battery cables. I'll show you. I like using these for strippers. They're pretty simple. You can do it with one hand while you have a hand on the wire, or if you have a hand on the crimps ready to go. Not much effort needed to strip the wires, and if you can use a razor blade if you want to, but some people end up cutting the wire by accident. This is a crimp tool I've gotten online. It was $40. Okay, if you can't read it, Tool Aid 18910. This is the crimp that I like to use. It's actually going to crimp all of our weather packs, all of our small crimps. Is actually going to fold them over nicely. When you're doing the weather packs, I'll show you that in this video or another video later, but you do it in stages. First stage, second stage, till you get to the third stage and it's actually fully crimped. So it's cheaper than those super expensive ones that they recommend here in the book. Now I'm not going to go page by page. Like I said, it's going to be different for everybody, but we got wiring diagrams, and the next page I find really important. Okay, not yet. That's going to break down the gauges, how to wire the gauges. So it's a template for the fuse box, so you can cut this paper out or you can trace it, and you can actually mount this to the firewall accurately and trying to make a template yourself. It's already made right here. Now if you get a car specific, it's going to show you where to mount the fuse box. It's going to show you which direction all the wires are going to go. It's actually going to break it down for you so you can route your wires. If this is your first time, this is going to be a big help knowing which way the wires need to go. Now there's a lot more specific things I'm skipping, all these different wiring diagrams. We'll break that down later. Then on the back, it shows you exactly what fuses go where inside the block. So everything is nice and clear. What wires go where is nice and clear. Go through that, get a basic knowledge of what you're about to do before you just start throwing wire around. Okay, so now you've gone through the book. You've got a little bit of a grasp on wiring diagrams. You've got a little bit of a grasp on what's going to have to go where. Now it's time to actually unravel the harness, make sure it's not tangled up. I do it here on my toolbox, but try doing it on maybe a table or a bigger surface. My floor is too dirty to do this on my floor, it gets all dusty. Now, what I love about these wiring harnesses is every single wire is labeled all the way to the end. Okay, so I'm just gonna pull a random wire. I don't know what this is off the top of my head. So let's read what this is. Radio bat signal. Okay, so this is the ignition wire for the radio. It's gonna say, the car is on, you should be on. Pretty simple. So another random wire, I know this one off the top of my head just by looking at it. But we have turn signal, rear turn signal, horn relay ground, okay? So obviously, or maybe not obviously, this is the connector for the steering column. That's usually what steering columns connectors look like on a lot of different vehicles. That's what's so great about these harnesses, that every single wire is labeled. Okay, so get you a bunch of these cheap floor mats. It's gonna save your knees and your back and your elbows, all sorts of stuff. I got them right here on both sides of the car on the ground, and I got a whole bunch of them inside the car. That's what I'm gonna be laying on, because we're gonna be underneath this dash in a somewhat uncomfortable position for quite some time, wiring this up. So we're gonna start with location of the fuse box. This determines on what harness you got, what car you have. So I can't tell you exactly where it needs to go, but for an example, there's different harnesses that are under the seat fuse box wiring harness, under the dash, in the trunk. So make sure you get the right fuse box and wiring harness for the location that you want it to be. This is a somewhat direct replacement of the original, so it should go somewhere near the original location. And like what you saw earlier in the video, this harness comes with a recommendation of where it should go. A lot of wiring harnesses will actually have that. Once I get this where I want it, then I'll start laying out the wires inside the car and what direction they're supposed to go. So when finding a placement for a fuse box, just make sure it's somewhere you can access it somewhat easily. On the custom cars, I like to weld nuts on the inside of the kick panels or on the inside of the firewall to mount the fuse box to, so there's no holes anywhere in the firewall at all. A lot cleaner that way. That's usually when you're going to paint the car after the fact. This one's already painted, so I don't have the option to weld anything on, but it's still going to look really nice. It's still going to look really clean. Okay, so I have mine mounted. It's a little bit different from original. Originally they're up here and they're really hard to get to. When you're mounting your fuse box, always think about what's behind it. You don't want to be drilling any bolts into something important on the outside of the car, and we don't want to put any extra holes on the firewall, so both of my bolts are going into the inner fender here. It's hard to see, and we're at the point where it's going to be a big mess, but don't worry, it'll make more sense as we do step by step. First we got that mounted, then I put my relay panel right in here. Okay, so I was able to put that in with the dash off, but it's also accessible from underneath the dash after the car's back together. So now we're at the point where it feels overbearing to most people. We got the fuse box mounted. I have my relays close. Everything's in a nice, easy area to get to later on down the road. Now we need to determine which direction this wiring needs to go. Front, back, is it staying in the cab? Is it going to the dash? Is it going over the heater box? All that kind of stuff. So we're just going to break it down a wire strand at a time. So we need to untangle this and get the wires going in the right direction, one group at a time. We're only looking for direction, which way it needs to go, and send it off that way. We'll break down what each one needs to do after we're more organized. Well, now I'm going to start with the longest one that we have here. Since all these wires are labeled, you probably can't read them very well in the video, but I'll read them out loud. So the dead giveaway on this one is the electrical fan. That's the orange one right here. But then we have headlight, high beam, low beam. So since this one has electrical fan in it, of course it's going forward. Everything that's going to go forward, we're going to loop it all together and just curl it around on top of the engine. So we're just working on direction and organization first. Whenever you're running any wires through the firing wall at all, make sure you use some type of rubber grommet. A lot of times you just get these at a local parts store, a grommet kit of a bunch of different sizes. What I like about these is if I'm shoving one down in the corner, I can cut a corner square out of it and it's still going to pop in and hold and keep the wires from rubbing. As long as you don't have wires rubbing on the steel of the car, these rubber grommets are going to keep it from grounding out, jumping, all that kind of nastiness that you don't want to have happen. 2 or 3 months from putting this car together. And I like to use hole saws to cut these out. You can get hole saws that are exactly the exact same size as these rubber grommets, and they'll pop right in. They'll hold themselves in. You don't have to put sealer on them or anything like that. Now that I got them through, I'm not going to worry about where it's going out here yet. Just going to get them somewhat organized so it's not a big mess. Okay, so when I was pulling the wiring harness through the firewall, I noticed a connector I'm not used to seeing. It was a short connector, so it didn't make it very far out the firewall. It's like, okay, it's something for the engine. Then I read the labels on the wires, and the labels on the wires said left turn signal, right turn signal. And for a split second, I was like, why would they want turn signals so close to the firewall? So right here in the instructions, this is a breakdown of the labeled wires. So whatever it's labeled, it's right here, it's labeled, and there's a definition of what that wire is for. Since it said turn signals, I went to the breakdown circuit branch front lighting connections. It said these are connections for the hood mounted directional lights not used on 64 through 66 models. So I'm not going to do anything with those lights. So technically this car is not going to need that connection, but that's how you can easily identify what you're working with, if you need it, if you don't need it. Now the cool part that I was thinking when I saw that, it's not going to be worthless. This car has the halo LED lights around the actual main light. Now I was thinking it'd be really cool when he turns on his blinker for that also to flash the halo. But that was a cool thought of something that I could actually use that for. Okay, one down, just a couple more to go. So let's break down our next set of wires. So at any point in time, if you don't know what a wiring harness goes to or what direction it needs to go in, read the labels on the wires. And if that doesn't give you enough information, relay the labels on the wires to that breakdown I just showed you. It's going to tell you engine compartment, trunk, something like that. You'll have a better idea which direction it needs to go in. Okay, so I'm purposely picking the ones I know it's going to go to the front and moving those first to get them out of the way. But I'm also just explaining it so I can break it down for you. So I'm going to pick this one next because I already know where it's going. But if we're going to read through it, we got an alternator ignition. I'm going to have to break that down in a different video. We're not going to need that because we have a GM 1-wire alternator, and I'll explain how to hook that up in another part of the series. Then the red one says, you can see it, 12-volt battery wire. So what I like to do, and what's actually normal for the original cars, is that this is hooked up to the battery plus side of the starter solenoid. Let's go ahead and run these through the front. Okay, so we just went over this. We know that's going into the engine compartment, and split from that, we have more wires. Now, this is pretty long from the fuse box, so we need to figure out, is this going to the front also, or is it not? So here we go. We can break these down again. Come up here and reference. So I'm gonna pick one out on purpose. This pink one, ignition feed coil. So that breaks that one down for us. Now what is this other one here? This one says starter solenoid. We know why it's all connected to the same harness. This is all gonna go outside the car. This is gonna be down on the transmission where I'm gonna put the neutral safety switch. And that's where the reverse lights are gonna get switched from, is down there. So I'm gonna cut these zip ties so I can roll it out straight and feed it through my grommet on the firewall. Whenever you're feeding some wires to the wall, I like to just spin them up like this, get them real tight just on the end, and when I get to the other side, I'll undo it and peel it apart. But I get them twisted up tight like this, it'll feed the little grommet a lot easier, and I'll be able to grab all the wires and pull them through. It sucks pulling one wire through and the other one's folded backwards in on itself inside the vehicle, so just something that I do to make it easier on myself. When you're feeding these through the firewall, you might run into a situation where it gets tough, a little hard to pull the wires, and some guys would want to just yank on it a little bit to get it through and just get it over with. But I got a short wire here in my harness, so that obviously shows me it's hooked on something. And when you yank this, you could be cutting a wire, stripping the insulation off of it, and I'm not in the business to do things twice, and you shouldn't be either. So take your time in feeding these wires, go back and forth as many times as it takes, and find out what it's snagged on. So okay, so I think we have all the wires that we need that's coming out from the firewall into the engine compartment actually out here now. Take a second for yourself and just don't actually run them, but get them organized back into their groups. So we made that split here earlier. So just clean this up real quick. And wires can scratch paint, so be careful. Pull them back apart into their sections so you don't get them mixed up. See, I got a harness going through the middle of another harness just because how it got fed. So get everything split back up. Now I'm not done wiring everything on the inside, get everything where it needs to go. So I'm gonna just get them in their sections, spin them up real quick, and throw a simple zip tie on them. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, you're wasting zip ties doing that. Yeah, maybe, but if that's something you're worried about in this process, you probably shouldn't be wiring in the first place because we're going to be wasting a lot of zip ties before we're done. So now everything's organized out here, ready to be wired up. So once we get everything in its proper space, we can break it down piece by piece. Okay, so let's keep breaking these down piece by piece. This one should be pretty easy because we have dash light, high beam indicator light, left dash indicator, water temp sensor. Okay, so this is gonna be for all of our gauges and indicator lights on the dash. So obviously that's gonna be an easy one to route. We're gonna bring it up and just hide it up here for now, so it's in its proper location. And we get to the dash portion, I'll explain wiring up the dash. Now don't pay attention to this over here. That's all the radio wiring that was extra in this car. Now, if you look at this, the amount of wires that we have left is slowly dwindling down, and it's about to get even shorter here because there's not too much left. This is a connection. I know it just by looking at it, but if we read it, we got tail lights, left rear turn, right rear turn. So this is the connector that's going to connect to this wiring harness here to give us our rear tail light section. So we just need to find a nice place to coil this up and get rid of some of the slack in here. Now when you're routing your wires, make sure you're paying attention to stuff like brake pedals. We don't want to smash any of our wires on anything. And our parking brake, it has this nasty little tab down in there that actually locks it in place. Oh, I can't see it very well in the video. You can see it right there moving down at the end. Make sure you're not going to cut any of your wires off of just little simple stuff like that. So pay attention when you're routing your wire. So now would be a good time to get out some of the switches that the kit came with. The switches are going to tell you what connector it needs, so that's pretty straightforward. That's going to be this connector. This is our headlight switch. That's going to be this big connector here. Our high-low beam for the floor. And this is a lot longer than it needs to be just to get to right there in the dash. So a simple way would be to spin this up, zip tie it up nicely, and hide it underneath the dash somewhere it's out of the way from moving parts. Or if you really want to take the time, you can actually trim these to be a lot shorter. Just make sure you put shrink wrap and butt connectors on everything. You gonna help? Get in here and start working on something. You can earn your keep around here. That's what I thought. Alright, so me and Apache here ran into a common problem. So since I was going through my switches, making sure all the wiring is going to be where it needs to be, I was double checking all my different connections. I ran into the problem of the wiper switch. Now here's a Mustang wiper switch. Quite complicated, overcomplicated I would say. And here's our connector with a bunch of nasty connections. Now this is the old wiring harness. I never throw it away until I'm completely done and the car's running and driving fine. I'm always going to use this as a reference. I looked at this connector, tried to find it in a wiring harness, didn't have this connector here. So I dug through the wiring diagrams real quick and it showed me that this is for the wiper. One switch and on and off for wipers. That's not going to let me change the speeds, and it's not going to let me use the washer on the window. This is just an in and out power. This is not going to work for this setup, so watch out for little stuff like that. Luckily enough, this is a Mustang. I could just buy the wiper harness from CJ Pony Parts. work on everything else. And when that gets here, I'll just wire that into the switches. So now I'm going to go ahead and work on not necessarily wiring up our switches, but getting the switches back on the dash. Take a mental note of which connector is for which, so I know where it needs to go, and I can keep moving forward in our wiring process. So what I'm doing right now is I'm looking up my pictures I took. So one thing I recommend when you're taking a car apart is take a lot of pictures. Take pictures of how the wiring went, take pictures of the color of the wires and the connectors, take a picture where your switches went on the dash. So right now I'm actually looking up where my switches were on this dash before I took it apart. Yeah, it's something easy to remember, but it's also something easy to mistake in and switch back and forth. And I just like to be very thorough in every step that I make. Okay, so at this point we've really broken down what we don't know yet and what we do know. Column switch, rear harness, ignition. Now, looking down each wire, then it says CTSV-SW. That sounds really complicated. Look it up in my instruction booklet. It says this is for the door switches for the courtesy lights. So that's one whole harness. We know exactly what it does. So we're going to set that to the side. And really, what we need to start doing is start plugging in the switches and start wiring the dash. Now, I'm only getting things where they need to be. So since we're only doing it one step at a time, I'm getting things where they need to be, and then I'm wiring them up later. So really all we have left at this point is our wiring harness that goes back to the taillights. Let's run our last harness, and the next step will be wiring everything up. Okay, so now we're going to run the rear harness. Now this was just in one loop and zip tied together. So what I'm actually going to do is zip tie it all the way down. And when it gets to the back, when I actually go to wire the back, I'm going to cut out what I need to cut out at that point. But when you run into a situation where there's no zip ties on it, do that out of the car instead of trying to fight it in the car. Because I don't want this spread out on the inside and miss a zip tie and get cut off by a window, something like that. Usually when you run a rear harness, or if you're running a rear box and you're running wires forward, you don't want to run it underneath the carpet. There's going to be a lot of foot traffic, wet shoes. Most of the time you don't want to run it down the center, underneath the carpet in the center console, because then somehow it's going to have to go underneath the rear seat and get smashed by the rear seat. A lot of cars have this little kick panel right here with holes in it, and it's connected so it can go right here down the side of the sill plate. This one has a nice valley right here. This one has a nice valley, so wires are never going to get smashed, whatever's stuck in here. So try to route it in some kind of way where you're thinking in the future that they're not going to get stepped on. Now I'm about to kill the 30-40 zip ties. What I like to do is run everything as clean as possible. Now what I'm going to do is zip tie these up every hand length. So I'm going to run it up, a zip tie, clip it down, put another zip tie in, zip it down, put another zip tie in, zip it down. And that's going to make it where the zip ties are a nice orderly fashion. And every time I zip it down, I'm going to pull the wires tight, and I'm going to make sure that the colors never cross one another. So throughout my zip tie, you'll never see colors of wires spinning around each other. All the colors are going to be straight all the way through. Some people might think that's overkill, but you're also underkilling your quality, is the way I look at it. Another point of that is maybe 20, 30 years from now, maybe I'm being optimistic, but someone's been taking good care of this car. They do actually run into an electrical issue. When they look up underneath the dash, you won't be tracing wires. You'll actually be able to point them out and just look. You'll be able to follow the color where it goes. You'll be able to follow it all the way through its whole circuit. It's never twisted, it's never bound, it's never bent and hidden anywhere. Nice clean wiring all the way through. That just makes it much easier to repair, and it just makes you look good. So it's little things like that that makes you stand out from the average guy wiring up a car opposed to a professional wiring up the car. So always try to do the best that you can. I'm gonna get to zip tying. Okay, now you can see here I'm finished zip tying it up. Not a single color folds over another. It's easily traceable if you're going back tracing wires. And most importantly, the wire is really tight, so if you go for anything at all, at least go for a tight wire. So when I go to feed this down the full length of the body, it's going to be a lot easier. I'm not going to be working with loose wires folding up on each other, getting stuck around corners. It's going to be a lot easier to feed this through. Now if you're having a hard time running wire through a bin like this, you're trying to feed it down and you can't get it to where you can actually grab the wire and pull it through, You have two different options. Sometimes you can get a coat hanger. You can crimp a butt connector to the wire and to the coat hanger. And it's easier to fish a coat hanger up through a corner. You get one of these fancy things I get from Home Depot, and this will row out to 25 feet long. It's nice and stiff, so it's easy to bend around turns, and it won't fold up on itself. Then I can just reel it back in and then pull the wires through a lot easier, a long distance that way, like all the way through a frame. I pulled wires all the way through a box Model A frame with this, so it's something to look at depending on your situation. Okay guys, I got the wiring pulled through to the trunk. I made sure it wasn't gonna get smashed anywhere by the window regulator, or the gears. I got the wiring for the front part of the harness in the engine compartment. I watched out for sharp edges on the metal, any heat sources like exhaust. Gotta make sure you route the wires around and away from the exhaust. There are heat wraps you can get, like a fabric style of aluminum foil, but I tried to avoid that if all possible. You can buy a set of hose saws and rubber grommets from the same auto parts store, go home and actually have a nice pass through the firewall or in around the cab that you need to go. This car is actually going to get a battery in the trunk, a battery shut-off switch. So we have a little bit of more wiring routing to show you, but that's going to be a video on its own. If you have really tight wires, nicely dressed, and you run into an issue, it's going to be easier to find that issue, and it's going to be easier to do any type of electrical maintenance or upgrades in the future. This YouTube channel is actually a new venture for me, so if you have any questions of something that you want to see, or if you have any questions of something I skimmed over too fast, feel free to shoot them down in the comment section, but make sure you like this video and you subscribe. Thank you for watching.